Margaret Beaufort was 12 years old when they sold her to Edmund Tudor. Not married, sold. Her guardians had spent 3 years fighting over who would control her massive inheritance, and Edmund won the bidding war. The wedding took place quickly, before anyone could challenge the arrangement. Margaret stood at the altar in a dress that had been hastily altered to fit her child's body, repeating vows she barely understood. The marriage was legal. The church allowed girls to marry at 12. But there was an unspoken rule among nobility that you waited until the bride was at least 14 before consummating the union. Edmund Tudor was 24 years old, and he decided he couldn't wait. Within weeks of the wedding, Margaret's body began changing in ways that terrified her. The nausea started first, then the swelling. Palace physicians confirmed what the servants had been whispering. The 12-year-old bride was pregnant. Medieval medicine understood enough about childbirth to know this was dangerous. A girl Margaret's age hadn't finished growing. Her hips were too narrow. Her body wasn't ready to carry a child, much less deliver one. The physicians told Edmund this directly. They warned him that forcing consummation this early could kill both his wife and any child she conceived. Edmund didn't care. He had married Margaret for her inheritance and her political connections. Getting her pregnant immediately ensured that even if she died, he would have an heir to control her fortune. She was an investment that needed to start paying dividends. Margaret spent her pregnancy in a state of constant physical agony. Her small frame couldn't support the growing child. Her spine curved under the weight. She couldn't walk without assistance by her 7th month. Servants had to carry her from room to room because standing made her legs buckle. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological torture of knowing what was coming. Medieval women talked about childbirth in whispers, sharing horror stories about friends and relatives who had died screaming. Margaret heard all of it. She knew that fully grown women with wide hips and strong bodies died in labor regularly. Her chances of survival were almost non-existent. Then Edmund died of plague when Margaret was 7 months pregnant. For a brief moment, some of the women around her hoped this might give her a chance. Without a husband demanding she continue the pregnancy, perhaps the physicians could do something to end it early and save her life. But medieval law was clear. The child she carried was Edmund Tudor's heir. That baby represented a claim to the English throne through complex family connections. Ending the pregnancy wasn't just murder. It was treason against the realm. Margaret would have to carry this child to term even if it killed her, which everyone assumed it would. In January 1457, Margaret went into labor at Pembroke Castle. She was 13 years old. Her body had been ravaged by 7 months of pregnancy it couldn't handle, and now she had to push an entire human being through a birth canal that hadn't finished developing. But the wedding night was just the beginning of her nightmare. The labor lasted 2 days. Margaret's screams could be heard throughout Pembroke Castle, a sound so constant that servants began avoiding that wing of the building entirely. The midwives had seen difficult births before, but nothing prepared them for what they witnessed in that room. Margaret's body simply wasn't large enough. The baby couldn't pass through her pelvis normally. Every contraction that should have moved the child forward instead tore Margaret's internal tissues. Blood pooled beneath her on the birthing chair, so much blood that midwives kept replacing the cloths under her, knowing they were probably watching a child die. Medieval midwives had limited tools and even less medical knowledge. They couldn't perform cesarean sections on living women. That procedure was reserved for extracting babies from mothers who had already died. So they did the only thing they could. They tried to manually widen Margaret's birth canal, stretching and tearing tissue with their hands, while Margaret shrieked in agony. The baby finally emerged on January 28th, a boy, alive. They named him Henry. Margaret had survived the actual delivery, which surprised everyone present. But survival came with a permanent price. The damage to Margaret's body was catastrophic. The tearing had been so extensive that she hemorrhaged for days afterward. Infection set in almost immediately because medieval hygiene standards were non-existent. Her fever spiked so high that she became delirious, hallucinating that Edmund had returned from the dead to force her through another pregnancy. But the worst damage wasn't visible from the outside. Margaret's reproductive organs had been destroyed. The forced stretching, the tearing, the infection, all of it had left internal scarring so severe that physicians examining her weeks later knew immediately she would never conceive again. Margaret Beaufort was 13 years old and permanently sterile. One pregnancy had taken everything her body could give. She had produced the heir everyone demanded, and it had cost her any chance of having more children. Her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, documented the birth in his writings years later. He called it a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. That's medieval speak, for everyone expected both mother and child to die. The fact that either survived was considered divine intervention. But Margaret wasn't celebrating her survival. She spent months recovering in bed, unable to walk, suffering through infection after infection, as her body tried to heal from injuries it wasn't equipped to repair. The pain was constant. Every day she wished she had died during the delivery because at least death would have ended the suffering. The servants who attended her during recovery reported something disturbing. Margaret rarely spoke. She would lie in bed staring at nothing, occasionally whispering her son's name. The trauma of the birth had broken something in her mind. She was physically present, but mentally absent, trapped in some internal hell where the screaming never stopped. Palace physicians tried everything they knew to help her heal. Bloodletting, which obviously made things worse, herbal poultices that did nothing for internal damage. Prayers and blessings from priests who believed her suffering was either divine punishment or spiritual warfare. Nothing worked because the damage was simply too extensive. By the time Margaret could walk again, almost a year had passed. She was 14 years old, moving like an elderly woman, her body permanently altered by what it had endured. The cheerful child who had entered marriage was gone. In her place was someone hollowed out by pain, someone who had learned that being female and valuable meant your body wasn't your own. She survived childbirth, but what came next would test her in ways physical pain never could. Margaret was 13 years old, permanently damaged, and suddenly one of the wealthiest women in England. Edmund's death had left her in control of his estates and her own substantial inheritance. In medieval society, that made her incredibly valuable and incredibly vulnerable at the same time. The laws were simple and brutal. Margaret couldn't own property in her own name. She couldn't make legal decisions. She couldn't even control her own son's upbringing without a husband's permission. As a widow, she was essentially a walking pile of money that needed a man attached to it to be legitimate. The vultures circled immediately. Noble families across England saw Margaret as an opportunity. Marry her off to one of their sons, and they would control her fortune. Better yet, they would control young Henry Tudor, who had claims to the English throne through his mother's bloodline. In the brutal politics of medieval England, that made the boy incredibly dangerous to some people and incredibly valuable to others. Margaret's own family moved first. Her wardship was transferred to her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. He was one of the few people who seemed to genuinely care about her welfare rather than just her money. But even Jasper understood the reality. Margaret needed to remarry for her own protection. An unmarried wealthy woman was a target for kidnapping, forced marriage, or worse. The negotiations for her second marriage began while Margaret was still recovering from the birth. She was barely 14 when they presented her with her options. Men she had never met, some twice her age, all eager to claim her and everything she represented. The choice wasn't really hers, it never had been. She married Henry Stafford in 1458. He was at least younger than Edmund had been, and the marriage contract specified that it wouldn't be consummated until Margaret was fully recovered. That should have been a relief. Instead, it was a constant reminder of what had been done to her body and what would eventually be demanded of it again. But this marriage was different in one crucial way. Henry Stafford couldn't give her more children, and everyone knew it. The damage from her first pregnancy was too severe. Medieval physicians had examined her and declared her barren. That medical diagnosis, ironically, gave Margaret something she had never had before: freedom from the expectation of endless pregnancies. The freedom came with its own horror. Margaret watched other noble women go through pregnancy after pregnancy, many dying in childbirth just as everyone had expected her to. She attended their funerals, looked at their orphaned children, and felt a twisted mixture of guilt for surviving and relief that she would never have to endure that terror again. Her son Henry was taken from her when he was 5 years old. Not because she was an unfit mother, but because that's what happened to valuable male heirs. They were raised in other noble households, educated and trained for whatever role politics demanded of them. Margaret had sacrificed her body to produce this child, and now she couldn't even keep him with her. The separation destroyed what was left of her emotional stability. She had endured a traumatic marriage, a pregnancy that nearly killed her, and permanent physical damage. The only thing that had made any of it remotely meaningful was her son. Now he was gone, being raised by strangers, and she had no legal right to demand his return. Henry Stafford died in 1471. Margaret was 28 years old and facing her third marriage. By this point, something had changed in her. The broken, traumatized girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned to navigate the brutal world of medieval politics by becoming more ruthless than the men who tried to control her. She chose her third husband carefully. Thomas Stanley was one of the most powerful nobles in England, a man with connections to multiple factions in the ongoing Wars of the Roses. He could protect her and, more importantly, he could protect her son. The marriage was a calculated political move, not a romantic union. But Margaret was learning something her tormentors never expected. She was discovering how to use their own weapons against them. The laws said she couldn't own property or make decisions without a husband. Fine. She would choose husbands who gave her the freedom to operate behind the scenes. She couldn't command armies or make treaties in her own name. Fine. She would manipulate the men who could, pulling strings from the shadows while they took public credit. The Wars of the Roses were tearing England apart. The York and Lancaster families were locked in a brutal struggle for the throne, with battles and executions happening regularly. Margaret watched nobles rise and fall, entire families wiped out overnight when they backed the wrong side. And she began to see an opportunity in the chaos. Her son, Henry Tudor, was in exile, hiding in Brittany because the current king, Richard III, considered him a threat to the throne. Henry's claim to kingship was weak, based on complicated family connections that most people dismissed as irrelevant. But Margaret saw something others didn't. In a country exhausted by civil war, weak claims didn't matter as much as timing and opportunity. She started planning, not openly, because that would have been treason and meant execution, but quietly, using her husband's connections and her own careful cultivation of relationships with other nobles who were tired of the current regime. She sent secret messages to her son in Brittany. She gathered intelligence on Richard III's support base. She identified potential allies and began the slow work of convincing them that her exiled son could be England's salvation. The risk was enormous. If Richard III discovered what she was doing, Margaret would be executed as a traitor. Her husband might be executed alongside her. Everything she had survived, all the pain and trauma and loss, would end with her head on a block. But Margaret had already lost everything that mattered to her. Her childhood, her health, her fertility, years of separation from her only child. What was left to lose except a life that had been nothing but suffering since age 12? But everything she had endured was about to either destroy her completely or place her son on the throne of England. The conspiracy to overthrow Richard III began in 1483, and Margaret Beaufort was at its center. Not publicly, never publicly. Women didn't lead rebellions in medieval England, but privately, through coded letters and carefully arranged meetings, she orchestrated one of the most ambitious plots in English history. Richard III had seized the throne through what most people considered murder. His two young nephews, the rightful heirs, had disappeared into the Tower of London and were never seen again. England was horrified, but powerless. Richard had the army and the political backing to hold his position. Opposing him openly meant death. Margaret saw her opening. A king stained by child murder was vulnerable to someone who could present themselves as a moral alternative. Her son, Henry Tudor, exiled and unthreatening, could be positioned as England's savior. It didn't matter that his claim to the throne was weak. What mattered was that people were desperate for an alternative to Richard. She began with Richard's enemies, nobles who had lost family members or political positions during his rise to power. These men were already angry, already looking for revenge. Margaret didn't have to create their hatred. She just had to direct it toward her son as the solution to their problems. The meetings were dangerous. Margaret couldn't be seen conspiring with Richard's enemies, so she used intermediaries, trusted servants who carried verbal messages, leaving no written evidence, priests who could move between households without suspicion, her own husband Thomas Stanley, who maintained careful neutrality in public while allowing his wife to plot treason in private. Medieval punishment for treason was designed to be as horrific as possible. Men were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Women were burned alive. Margaret knew exactly what awaited her if she was caught. She had watched executions, seen the bodies of traitors displayed on city walls as warnings. Every meeting she arranged, every message she sent, was a calculated gamble with her life. But the real genius of Margaret's conspiracy was how she framed it. She wasn't plotting to overthrow the rightful king. She was working to restore proper order by removing a usurper who had murdered children. She presented Henry Tudor not as a power-hungry exile, but as a reluctant hero being called home to save England from tyranny. The rhetoric worked because it played into medieval beliefs about divine right and proper succession. Richard might have the throne, but he didn't have God's blessing. The proof was in his crimes. Margaret positioned her son as heaven's chosen instrument to correct this cosmic wrong. By 1485, Margaret had assembled a coalition of nobles willing to support Henry Tudor's invasion. The logistics were nightmarish. Henry was in France with a small army of exiles and mercenaries. He needed ships to cross the Channel, money to pay his soldiers, and most importantly, he needed English nobles to rise up and support him the moment he landed. Margaret coordinated all of it. She smuggled money to France through merchant networks. She sent intelligence about Richard's military positions and troop movements. She convinced wavering nobles to commit to the rebellion by promising them positions and lands once Henry took the throne. All of this while maintaining the appearance of a loyal subject who would never dream of treason. The strain was enormous. Margaret barely slept. Every unexpected visitor could be Richard's agents coming to arrest her. Every delayed message from France could mean her son was captured or killed. She developed stress-related illnesses, mysterious fevers and pains that physicians couldn't explain, but were clearly connected to the constant anxiety of orchestrating a rebellion. Her husband Thomas Stanley was in an impossible position. He loved Margaret, but he also had his own political survival to consider. Richard III didn't entirely trust him, but couldn't afford to alienate such a powerful noble without solid proof of betrayal. Thomas walked a knife's edge, publicly supporting Richard while privately allowing his wife to plot the king's downfall. The breaking point came in August 1485. Henry Tudor landed in Wales with approximately 2,000 soldiers. Richard III assembled a much larger army, around 12,000 men. By every military calculation, the rebellion should have been crushed immediately. Margaret's years of planning should have ended with her son's head on a spike, but Margaret had done something extraordinary. She had convinced several key nobles, including her own husband, to hold back their forces during the battle. They would wait and see which side was winning before committing their troops. It was a coward's strategy, but it was also brilliant. By remaining neutral, these nobles forced Richard to fight without the reinforcements he was counting on. The night before the battle at Bosworth Field, Margaret didn't sleep at all. She prayed, bargained with God, and faced the real possibility that everything she had suffered through might be for nothing. Her son could die tomorrow. She could be arrested as a traitor. The conspiracy could collapse, taking everyone involved down with it. She had spent 30 years surviving trauma, manipulation, and political chaos. She had sacrificed her body at age 12 to produce an heir. She had endured 2 more marriages as political arrangements. She had lived separated from her only child for most of his life. All of it, every moment of suffering, had been building toward this single day. Everything she had endured was about to either destroy her completely or place her son on the throne of England. The Battle of Bosworth Field lasted less than 2 hours on August 22, 1485. Richard III died fighting, his body hacked apart by Welsh soldiers after his horse fell. They stripped his corpse naked and threw it across a horse like a slaughtered animal, parading it through the streets so everyone could see that the king was dead. Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield, still covered in mud and blood. At 28 years old, he became Henry VII of England, and Margaret Beaufort, at 42, became the most powerful woman in the kingdom. She didn't attend the battle. Women weren't allowed on battlefields, and Margaret's damaged body wouldn't have survived the journey anyway. She waited at home, sick with anxiety, until a messenger arrived with news of the victory. Her son was king. The conspiracy had worked. Everything she had suffered, all the trauma and pain and years of separation, had led to this moment. But Margaret didn't celebrate. She couldn't. The victory felt hollow because she understood what it had cost. Her childhood had been sold for political advantage. Her body had been destroyed, producing the heir who now wore the crown. She had spent decades separated from her son, watching him grow up from a distance, unable to be his mother in any meaningful way. Now he was king, and their relationship was more complicated than ever. Henry VII didn't really know his mother. He had spent most of his life in exile, raised by strangers, fighting to survive in foreign courts. Margaret was a stranger to him, someone he knew through letters and political necessity rather than genuine maternal connection. But medieval protocol gave Margaret something unprecedented. As the king's mother, she was given the title, My Lady the King's Mother, and treated with the same respect as a queen. She had her own household, her own income, and most importantly, her own political power. Henry VII trusted her judgment because she had orchestrated his rise to power. He gave her authority that no other woman in England possessed. Margaret took control of the royal household, managed diplomatic correspondence, and advised her son on everything from military strategy to marriage alliances. She dressed in partial nun's habits, projecting an image of pious devotion while wielding power that would have been impossible for any other woman to achieve. But the physical cost of her early trauma never left her. Margaret's body had been permanently damaged by the birth at age 13. She suffered from chronic pain that worsened as she aged. Her hips never properly healed. Walking became increasingly difficult. By her 50s, she needed assistance to move from room to room, her body betraying her, even as her political influence reached its peak. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had more power than any woman in England, but her body was a prison. She could command nobles, arrange marriages, and influence policy, but she couldn't walk across a room without pain. The girl who had been sold at 12 and destroyed at 13 had become the architect of a dynasty, but the price had been her physical health and any chance at normal motherhood. Margaret watched her son marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses and ending the Wars of the Roses. She watched her grandchildren being born, healthy babies delivered by mothers whose bodies hadn't been destroyed by child pregnancy. She attended christenings and celebrations, always dressed in her nun-like habits, always maintaining the image of pious devotion that made her political power more acceptable to men who would have challenged a more openly ambitious woman. But privately, Margaret struggled with demons that never left her. The trauma of her forced marriage and catastrophic childbirth had created psychological scars as deep as the physical ones. She had nightmares about the labor, waking up screaming decades after it happened. She became obsessive about her grandchildren's safety, terrified that they would suffer the way she had. Her relationship with her son remained distant. Henry VII respected her, relied on her political judgment, and gave her unprecedented authority. But there was no warmth between them. How could there be? They were strangers bound by blood and political necessity, not by the normal bonds of mother and child. Margaret had sacrificed everything to put him on the throne, including any chance of actually being his mother. She threw herself into religious devotion and charitable works, founding colleges and hospitals, translating religious texts from French into English. The work gave her life meaning beyond politics, a way to channel her suffering into something constructive. But it didn't erase the trauma. Nothing could erase what had been done to her at 12 years old. Margaret lived to see her son's reign stabilize, the Tudor dynasty established beyond any reasonable threat. She watched her grandchildren grow, the future of the line she had created with her broken body secured. She had accomplished everything she set out to do through years of careful planning and political maneuvering. But the woman who had survived hell to create a dynasty was about to discover that power came with its own grotesque price. Margaret Beaufort died on June 29, 1509, at 66 years old. She had outlived most of her contemporaries, surviving through decades that killed younger, healthier people. But survival doesn't mean living. Margaret's final years were a slow deterioration, her body finally giving up after decades of fighting against damage it should never have endured. The chronic pain that had plagued her since age 13 became unbearable in her 60s. Medieval physicians had no treatment for the internal scarring and skeletal damage caused by her traumatic childbirth. They tried bloodletting, which weakened her further. They applied herbal poultices that did nothing. They prayed over her, convinced her suffering was either divine punishment or spiritual warfare. Margaret knew better. Her suffering wasn't mystical. It was the direct result of what men had done to a 12-year-old girl's body. Every step she took reminded her of the forced pregnancy. Every breath reminded her of the labor that nearly killed her. Her body had been a battlefield since childhood, and it was finally losing the war. Her son Henry VII had died 2 months before her, in April 1509. Margaret attended his funeral, barely able to stand, watching them bury the son she had sacrificed everything to put on the throne. The son she barely knew because they had been separated for most of his life. The son who had given her power but never genuine affection. With Henry VII dead, Margaret's political influence evaporated almost immediately. Her grandson, the new Henry VIII, was 17 years old and had no interest in being managed by his grandmother. The power she had wielded for 24 years disappeared the moment her son stopped breathing. She spent her final weeks bedridden at Westminster Abbey, her body swollen with fluid from organ failure. The damage to her reproductive system from the catastrophic childbirth had created complications that spread throughout her abdomen over decades. Medieval physicians couldn't identify the specific medical problems, but modern analysis of historical records suggests she suffered from chronic pelvic inflammatory disease, likely caused by the infections that followed her traumatic delivery. The pain at the end was constant. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in fever dreams that took her back to Pembroke Castle and the 2-day labor that had destroyed her body. Servants reported that she would cry out, reliving the birth, even though it had happened 52 years earlier. The trauma had never left her. It had simply been buried under decades of political maneuvering and forced stoicism. Margaret died surrounded by priests and servants, but essentially alone. Her husband Thomas Stanley had died years earlier. Her son was dead. Her grandson barely knew her. The woman who had been the power behind the throne died the same way she had lived most of her life, isolated, in pain, and disconnected from genuine human warmth. They buried her in Westminster Abbey with full honors. The tomb was elaborate, befitting the mother of a king and grandmother of another, but the physical examination conducted before burial revealed details that shocked even medieval physicians accustomed to grotesque medical realities. Margaret's pelvis was catastrophically deformed. The bones had fractured during her childbirth at 13 and never healed properly. Instead, they had fused at odd angles, creating a skeletal structure that made walking increasingly painful over decades. Her spine showed evidence of severe curvature, the result of her child's body trying to support a pregnancy it wasn't equipped to handle. The internal examination was worse. Her reproductive organs were masses of scar tissue. The damage from the forced labor and subsequent infections had essentially destroyed her uterus and surrounding tissues. Medieval physicians had declared her barren at 13, but the physical evidence of why was horrifying even to people accustomed to medieval medical horrors. Her body was a testament to what happens when children are forced into adult roles. Every bone, every organ, every system showed evidence of catastrophic damage that had occurred before her body finished developing. She had lived for 53 years after the birth that destroyed her, but she had never stopped suffering from it. Centuries later, when historians exhumed medieval remains from Westminster Abbey for study, Margaret's skeleton told a story that documents couldn't fully capture. The fractures in her pelvis were consistent with traumatic childbirth in a body too young for pregnancy. The deformation of her hips and spine showed decades of chronic pain. The woman who had founded the Tudor dynasty had literally broken herself to do it. Margaret Beaufort's legacy is complicated. She was the mother of Henry VII and grandmother of Henry VIII. The Tudor line she created would rule England for over a century, producing some of the most famous monarchs in English history. She was also a patron of education and religion, founding colleges and translating important texts. But her personal story is a horror show that medieval society normalized. A girl sold into marriage at 12, raped by her adult husband, forced through a pregnancy that destroyed her body, and left permanently sterile before she turned 14. She survived by becoming more ruthless than the men who tried to control her, using their own political systems against them, and sacrificing any chance at normal human connection for power. The girl who overcame hell to rule a kingdom did so by becoming as cold and calculating as the system that had brutalized her. She created a dynasty, but the cost was her childhood, her body, her relationship with her son, and any chance at genuine happiness. Power was her revenge against a world that had destroyed her, but it was hollow revenge. She died in pain, alone, her body a permanent reminder of what had been done to her at 12 years old. The Tudor dynasty lasted until 1603, ruling England through its most transformative period. Every Tudor monarch, from Henry VII to Elizabeth I, owed their existence to Margaret Beaufort's destroyed body and her refusal to let that destruction be meaningless. She turned her trauma into political power, her suffering into a dynasty that changed English history. But late at night in Westminster Abbey, in the tomb where her deformed skeleton rests, there's no glory, just the bones of a child bride who paid for power with everything a human being can lose, and still somehow found a way to win.